History is not just about kings and dates. It is about problems and the strange ways people solve them. The biggest problem has always been survival. How do you protect your family, your city, your way of life? The answer for most of history was weapons. We think of swords and spears as simple tools of force. But sometimes human ingenuity took a sharp turn. It went somewhere weird. It created things that feel like they belong in a fantasy novel, not a history book. What if you could build a fire that water could not quench? Or a sword that was also a whip? What if you could capture a knight from his horse without even touching him? People in the past did not just dream these things. They built them, they used them in battle. And then, in many cases, the knowledge was lost. We are left with fragmented texts, strange archaeological finds, and a lot of questions. These are not just weapons. They are puzzles. They show us that ancient people were not simpler than us. And they were just as clever, just as desperate, and sometimes far more bizarre. Number 15. How do you create a fire that burns on water? Imagine you are on a wooden ship. The enemy is coming. Their ships are bigger, and there are more of them. You are defending your home, the city of Constantinople. The year is 674 AD. Your defeat seems certain, but your ship has a secret. On its prow, there is a large bronze tube shaped like a lion's head. As the enemy gets close, a thick, hissing stream of liquid fire shoots from the lion's mouth. It hits the enemy ship. The wood explodes in flames. Sailors jump into the water to escape. But the fire follows them. It floats on the surface of the sea, burning. There is no escape. This was Greek fire. It was one of the most terrifying and effective weapons in history. And we still do not know exactly what it was. The Byzantine Empire guarded the recipe as its most important state secret. The penalty for revealing it was death. The knowledge was passed down from one emperor to the next, a secret flame protecting the empire for centuries. For over 700 years, this weapon gave the Byzantine navy an almost unbeatable advantage. It saved Constantinople from two massive Arab sieges, first in 678 and again in 718. The historian Theophanes the Confessor, writing in the 9th century, credited the invention to a Christian refugee from Syria named Callinicos of Heliopolis. He brought this secret to Constantinople around 672, just in time to save the empire. What made it so impossible? First, it was a liquid. You could aim it. It was projected through a device called a siphon, a pump and nozzle system that was mounted on the front of their warships known as dronans. This was basically a flamethrower, more than 1,000 years before they were used in World War I. Think about the technology needed. You need a pump that can handle a corrosive, flammable liquid. You need a nozzle that will not melt. You need a way to ignite the substance as it leaves the tube or just before. Second, it was sticky. It clung to whatever it touched, like a kind of ancient napalm. This made it incredibly effective against wooden ships and siege towers. You could not just scrape it off. It had to burn itself out. The Byzantine princess and historian Anna Komnene, writing in the 12th century in her book, The Alexiad, described it in detail. She said it could be made to shoot out in any direction, and that it was made from a mixture of pine and certain other such evergreen trees combined with sulfur. But her account is likely a simplified version. The real recipe was far more complex. Third, and most bizarre, it could not be put out with water. In fact, some accounts suggest water made it burn even more intensely. This chemical property is what truly baffled and terrified their enemies. Imagine the psychological effect. The one thing you use to fight fire now becomes its fuel. It broke the rules of nature. So what was it? We do not have the recipe. It was lost to time, probably forever, after the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, and then a final time when the city fell to the Ottomans in 1453. But modern chemists and historians have some good theories. John Haldon, a leading Byzantine historian, has done extensive research on this. He and his team at the University of St. Andrews tried to reverse engineer the weapon based on historical descriptions. Their conclusion is that the base was almost certainly a light crude oil, or naphtha. This is a petroleum product. The Byzantines had access to natural crude oil seeps in the Black Sea region. But naphtha alone does not explain all its properties. To make it sticky and burn on water, it had to be mixed with other things. Pine resin is a likely candidate, which would have made it thick and gluey. Other proposed ingredients include sulfur, which would create suffocating fumes, and maybe quicklime. The reaction of quicklime with water generates a huge amount of heat, which could have been the ignition source. A mixture of naphtha, pine resin, and quicklime could theoretically create a substance that ignites on contact with water and is nearly impossible to extinguish. The loss of this knowledge is a stark reminder of how much we can forget. For centuries, a city was protected by a chemical formula. When the empire that guarded it fell, the formula vanished. It was a weapon so advanced it would take another 500 years for something comparable to reappear in the world. What secrets about ancient chemistry died with the last Byzantine alchemist? Was the formula for Greek fire a single stable recipe, or was it constantly being tweaked and improved over 700 years? Could a forgotten manuscript tucked away in a monastery library in Greece or Turkey still hold the key to this terrifying and impossible weapon? Number 14. Could a mirror really burn a Roman ship? The scene is the Siege of Syracuse, 214 BC. The mighty Roman Republic has sent its fleet to conquer the Greek city-state on the coast of Sicily. The city's defense is being led by one man, Archimedes. He is a mathematician and engineer, a genius. The Romans have ships and soldiers. Archimedes has his mind. As the Roman ships approach the city walls, the sun glints off something on the shore. Suddenly, a beam of intense light shoots out from the walls. It strikes a Roman ship. The wood begins to smolder, then smoke, then erupts into flames. The Romans are baffled. They are being attacked by the sun itself. This is the story of Archimedes' death ray. It is one of the most famous and debated tales of ancient weaponry. Did it really happen? Could a person in 212 BC really harness solar power to destroy an enemy fleet? It seems impossible. We think of solar power as a modern technology, something involving panels and electricity. The idea of using simple mirrors to set a ship on fire from hundreds of feet away sounds like mythology. The sources for this story are themselves a bit shaky. The most detailed accounts come from authors writing centuries after the event. The 2nd century AD author Lucian and the later historian Cassius Dio give colorful descriptions of the event. They claim Archimedes used an array of mirrors, probably polished bronze or copper shields, to focus the sun's rays onto a single point on the Roman ships. It would work like a giant magnifying glass. Each mirror would catch a piece of sunlight and redirect it. When hundreds of these reflections were aimed at the same spot, the combined energy would be immense, heating the wood to its combustion point. For centuries, people dismissed this as a legend. It just seemed too fantastical. But in recent times, scientists and engineers have put the idea to the test. In 1747, the French scientist Georges-Louis Leclerc-Comte de Buffon successfully used an array of 168 flat glass mirrors to ignite a wooden plank from 150 feet away. It proved the basic physics were sound. The most famous modern attempt was by the television show Mythbusters. They tried to recreate the death ray 3 separate times. In their first 2 attempts, they failed to create fire. They could create a hot spot, but not sustained combustion. They concluded the myth was busted. However, they faced several challenges. They were using modern glass mirrors, which might behave differently than polished bronze. The weather conditions had to be perfect, and most importantly, the target ship had to remain perfectly still for a long time, something a Roman warship would not do. But then, in 2005, a group of students at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, decided to try again. They used 127 1-foot square flat mirrors. They aimed them at a mock-up of a Roman ship's hull from 100 feet away. It took them about 10 minutes, but they got a small sustained fire. They proved that, under the right conditions, it was possible. Their success depended on a key insight. The goal was not to create an instant explosion of flame, but to heat a single spot until it reached its auto-ignition temperature, which for wood is around 300 degrees Celsius. It is a slow cook, not a sudden blast. This raises another point. The death ray may not have been designed to sink ships instantly. Its psychological impact would have been just as powerful. Imagine being a Roman soldier and seeing a ship in your fleet spontaneously catch fire for no apparent reason. You would think the gods were against you. It was a weapon of terror as much as a weapon of destruction. So, could it have happened? The physics says yes. The technology, polished bronze shields, was available. The genius, Archimedes, was certainly capable of figuring out the geometry. The main obstacles are practical. It would require hundreds of people working in perfect coordination. The sky would have to be clear. The Roman ships would need to be close and relatively still. It was not a reliable all-weather weapon. It was a specialized tool for a very specific situation. The story of the death ray, whether true or exaggerated, shows a different way of thinking about warfare. It was not about brute force, it was about using science and the natural world as a weapon. Archimedes did not need a bigger catapult, he just needed the sun. Is the historical debate just a product of spotty records, or did later writers invent the story to make Archimedes seem even more legendary? If it did work, why was this technology never used again in any other siege in history? And could the death ray have actually been a different, less spectacular weapon, like a device for throwing Greek fire, with the story of mirrors being added later for dramatic effect? Number 13, how do you lift a warship out of the water? Let's stay in Syracuse during the same siege in 214 BC. The Roman navy is not just facing death rays from a distance. They decide to attack the city walls directly from the sea. Under the command of Marcellus, they bring their quinqueremes, massive warships with 5 banks of oars, right up to the seaward defenses. The soldiers on board are ready with ladders to scale the walls. They think the city is theirs. They are wrong. From the top of the walls, a giant crane-like contraption appears. A massive iron hook. Some accounts say it looked like a giant hand or claw, swings down. It grabs the prow of the lead Roman ship. Then, with a groan of stressed timber and the shouts of astonished men, the front of the ship is lifted clear out of the water. The crane hoists the ship up, shaking it violently, throwing soldiers into the sea or against the city walls. And then, it either drops the ship, causing it to capsize and sink, or smashes it against the rocks at the base of the wall. The Roman fleet is thrown into chaos. They retreat in terror. This was the claw of Archimedes. It was a purely mechanical weapon, but one so huge and so powerful it seemed like the work of a god. The Roman historian Polybius, who was born not long after the siege, gives a detailed account of it. He described it as a crane with a grappling hook that could lift the front of a ship, suspend it in the air, and then drop it. The Roman historian Livy also describes the device, as does the later writer Plutarch, who wrote a biography of the Roman general Marcellus. And Plutarch wrote that Archimedes' machines made the Romans so paranoid that if they did but see a little rope or a piece of wood from the wall, they would cry out that Archimedes was moving some machine upon them and would turn their backs and fly. The concept itself sounds like something out of a monster movie. How could ancient engineers build a crane strong enough to lift a warship? A Roman quinquereme was a beast. It was over 100 feet long and could weigh over 100 tons when fully crewed and loaded for battle. Lifting even a part of that weight would require immense leverage and an incredibly strong structure. The genius of the device was Archimedes' understanding of levers and pulleys. He famously said, "Give me a place to stand, and I shall move the earth." The claw was a practical demonstration of that principle. The machine was likely a large wooden beam, or a series of beams, extending out over the city walls. On the landward side, it would have had a massive counterweight, probably a huge box filled with stones or lead. A system of ropes and pulleys would run along the beam to the grappling iron at the end. A team of men, or perhaps oxen, would pull on the ropes, using the mechanical advantage of the pulleys to lift the counterweight and swing the claw down. When the claw hooked a ship, they would release the counterweight, and its massive weight dropping would provide the force to lift the ship's prow. It was a brilliant piece of defensive engineering. It turned the city walls from a passive barrier into an active weapon. It also exploited a key Roman tactic. The Romans liked to bring their ships right up against fortifications to use siege towers and ladders. The claw punished them for this. The closer they got, the more vulnerable they were. Like the death ray, the claw has been the subject of modern reconstruction attempts. In 2005, the BBC series Secrets of the Ancient Empires built a full-scale version of the claw based on historical descriptions. They constructed a massive wooden crane on a set of mock city walls. They tested it on a replica of a Roman ship. Their machine worked. It successfully grabbed the ship and lifted its bow several feet into the air. While it did not lift the entire ship, it lifted enough to capsize it or cause catastrophic damage. The experiment demonstrated that the technology and materials available in the 3rd century BC were sufficient to build such a device. The claw of Archimedes represents a peak of ancient mechanical engineering applied to warfare. It was not a weapon that required exotic chemicals or unknown physics. It just required a perfect understanding of simple machines scaled up to a terrifying degree. It was a weapon born from pure intellect. It showed that one great mind could be worth more than an entire army. The Romans eventually took Syracuse, but they had to do it by treachery and a land assault. They never conquered Archimedes' machines. Were there multiple claws along the walls of Syracuse, or just one legendary machine that moved from place to place? How were the operators protected from Roman archers while they aimed and released the massive hook? And given its proven effectiveness, why do we not see giant ship-lifting cranes used in other coastal sieges throughout history? Was the genius of Archimedes simply impossible to replicate? Number 12. Why would you make a sword out of wood and glass? When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the early 16th century, they brought steel, gunpowder, and horses. They faced armies with weapons made of stone, wood, and animal hide. On paper, it was a technological mismatch of epic proportions. But the Spanish soon learned to fear one weapon in particular. It was a club, but it was not just a club. It was a flat, paddle-shaped weapon made of oak, about 3 to 4 feet long. And embedded along its edges were razor-sharp blades of obsidian. This was the macrohydal. The name comes from the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs. It means hand wood or hand stick. To the Spanish, it seemed primitive. It was not a sword. You could not thrust with it. It was heavy and required a lot of space to swing, but in the hands of a trained Aztec jaguar or eagle warrior, it was devastating. The Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, in his book The True History of the Conquest of New Spain, wrote about the macrohydal's terrifying power. He claimed that he saw an Aztec warrior decapitate a horse with a single blow. While this might be an exaggeration, it speaks to the weapon's reputation. What made it seem so impossible was its construction. It combined a simple material, wood, with a wickedly sharp one, obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass. When it is fractured, it can produce an edge that is many times sharper than a steel surgical scalpel. We are talking about an edge that is only a few molecules thick. It can slice through flesh, muscle, and sinew with terrifying ease. The Aztecs were masters of working with obsidian. They used a technique called pressure flaking to create prismatic blades, long, rectangular shards of glass that were incredibly sharp and uniform. These blades were then set into grooves carved along the sides of the hardwood paddle. They were cemented in place with a natural adhesive, probably a bitumen or a pine pitch resin. The result was a weapon that was part club, part sword, and part saw. The force of the blow came from the heavy wooden body. The cutting was done by the obsidian teeth. It was not designed to pierce armor. In fact, the obsidian was brittle and could shatter against Spanish steel plate. But most Aztec warriors did not have steel armor. The macrohydal was used against unprotected flesh or the padded cotton armor worn by Mesoamerican soldiers. The goal of Aztec warfare was also different. The primary objective was not always to kill the enemy, but to capture them for ritual sacrifice. The macrohydal was perfectly suited for this. A warrior could use the flat side of the weapon to knock an opponent unconscious. Or a glancing blow with the bladed edge could inflict a serious, disabling wound without being immediately fatal. The Spanish reported seeing horrific injuries caused by these weapons, including disembowelment and severed limbs. Archaeological evidence for the macrohydal is incredibly scarce. Wood and resin do not preserve well in the tropical climate of Mexico. The last known surviving macrohydal was held in the Royal Armory of Madrid in Spain. It was photographed and drawn in the 18th century. Tragically, it was destroyed in a fire in 1884. All we have left are those drawings and historical accounts from the Spanish and the Aztecs themselves in documents like the Codex Mendoza. Modern replicas have been made to test its effectiveness. These tests confirm that the weapon can inflict catastrophic wounds. A blow from a macrohydal does not just cut, it tears and shatters. The obsidian blades can break off in the wound, causing further damage and infection. It was a truly brutal weapon. The macrohydal is a fantastic example of making the most of what you have. The people of Mesoamerica did not have access to iron or bronze, so they perfected a different kind of technology. They mastered stoneworking to a degree that is hard to comprehend. They created a composite weapon that was perfectly suited to their environment and their style of warfare. It was not a clumsy stick with rocks on it. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering, a wooden frame designed to deliver a series of surgical-grade blades in a single powerful arc. How did Aztec artisans manage to create such uniform and sharp obsidian blades without modern tools? If a macrohydal could truly decapitate a horse, was its force more about the warrior's strength or the weapon's design? And without any surviving examples, can we ever be sure we understand the full sophistication of its construction and use? Number 11, can a sword also be a whip? Imagine a sword. It is long, flexible, and made of steel, but it is not rigid. It is as flexible as a leather belt. It moves like a ribbon in the wind. In the hands of a master, it is not one blade, but a blur of many. It can be worn as a belt, coiled up for concealment. When it is uncoiled, it transforms into a weapon that is almost impossible to defend against. It can flow over a shield, it can snake around a parry, it can strike from unexpected angles. This is the Urumi. The Urumi comes from the southern Indian state of Kerala, the birthplace of the ancient martial art Kalapayattu. It is perhaps one of the most dangerous and difficult to master weapons ever created. The name itself means curling blade. It consists of one or more thin, flexible steel blades, each about an inch wide and up to 5 or 6 feet long, attached to a small handle with a knuckle guard. Some versions have a single blade. Others have multiple blades, turning the weapon into a kind of steel octopus. The one used in Sri Lanka, known as an Athunu Kadua, could have as many as 30 blades attached to a single handle. What makes the Urumi seem impossible is the sheer skill required to use it. Wielding it is more like dancing than fighting. The user must keep the blades in constant motion, spinning them around their body to build momentum. The movements are circular and fluid. A flick of the wrist can send the steel whip lashing out at an opponent, and then just as quickly retract it into a defensive spin. Because the blade is so flexible, it is just as dangerous to the wielder as it is to the enemy. A moment of inattention, a slight miscalculation, and the user could easily inflict a grievous wound upon themselves. Training often began with a long piece of cloth before graduating to the real blade. The Urumi was not a primary battlefield weapon. You would not see an army of soldiers all carrying Urumis. It was a weapon for duels, for assassins, or for guarding valuable people or places. Its main advantage was its unpredictability. A traditional fighter trained to defend against a sword or a spear would not know how to react to the Urumi's fluid, multi-directional attacks. It was also excellent for crowd control. A single person spinning an Urumi could keep a large group of people at bay, as the weapon creates a dangerous zone around the wielder. The origins of the Urumi are ancient, likely dating back to the Mauryan Empire in India, which existed from 322 to 185 BC. The flexibility of the steel is key. India has a long history of producing high-quality steel, like the famous Wootz steel that was used to make Damascus blades. This metallurgical skill was essential for creating a blade that was strong enough to hold an edge but flexible enough to bend and whip without breaking. The Urumi's design is a direct contradiction to what we think a sword should be. A sword is supposed to be stiff, to thrust, and to parry. The Urumi sacrifices all of that for pure, chaotic, offensive power. It cannot be used to block an attack effectively. Its defense is its offense, the constant motion that creates a protective and deadly barrier. Watching a master of Kalapayattu use an Urumi is mesmerizing. It looks less like a fight and more like a performance. The steel blade becomes an extension of their body, flowing and spinning in patterns that are both beautiful and lethal. This weapon highlights the idea that a weapon's effectiveness is not just in its material or design, but in the tradition of skill and training that surrounds it. The Urumi is not a weapon you can just pick up and use. It requires a lifetime of dedication to master. Does the Urumi represent a unique branch in the evolution of swords that was simply too difficult and impractical to become widespread? How did the first Kalapayattu masters even conceive of a weapon that was so inherently dangerous to its own user? And are there techniques and forms for the Urumi that have been lost to time, known only to a handful of aging masters in Kerala? Number 10. How do you build a machine gun in the 3rd century? Speed has always been a key advantage in warfare. The faster you can shoot, the more likely you are to win. For most of history, archery was a slow process. A skilled archer could loose maybe 10 to 12 arrows a minute. A crossbowman was even slower, maybe 2 to 4 shots a minute, though the bolts were more powerful. But what if you could fire a crossbow as fast as you could pull a lever? What if you could have a magazine of bolts that fed automatically into the weapon? This was the Jugenu. The Jugenu, or the Chukonu as it is sometimes called, was a repeating crossbow from ancient China. It was a marvel of mechanical ingenuity. It seems impossible because it solved a problem that would vex European weapon designers for another 1,500 years how to create a simple, reliable, and rapid-fire weapon. The standard European crossbow required the user to place a bolt, draw the string back with a crank or a hook, and then fire. The Jugenu combined all of those actions into a single movement. The design was brilliant in its simplicity. The weapon had a rectangular box on top that acted as a magazine, holding a stack of 10 to 12 light bolts. This magazine was attached to a long lever. The crossbow string was attached to the back of this lever. To operate it, the user would hold the main stock of the crossbow steady and push the lever forward. This motion would cause a single bolt to drop from the magazine into the firing groove. At the same time, a set of claws would catch the bowstring. Then, the user would pull the lever back. This single backward motion would draw the bowstring, arming the weapon, and then, at the very end of the pull, a simple release mechanism would fire the bolt. Push forward, pull back, a bolt was fired. An expert could empty the entire magazine in less than 20 seconds. Its invention is attributed to the famous military strategist Zhuge Liang, who lived during the Three Kingdoms period in China around 181 to 234 AD. However, archaeological evidence suggests that simpler versions of repeating crossbows may have existed even earlier, possibly as far back as the 4th century BC. A tomb in Hubei province, dated to that period, contained a primitive repeating crossbow. But it was Zhuge Liang who is credited with perfecting the design and making it a standard issue weapon for his armies. The Zhuge Nu was not a weapon for snipers. It had a relatively short range and was not very powerful compared to a large siege crossbow. The bolts were small and light, often not even fletched with feathers. They would not penetrate heavy armor. But that was not its purpose. Its purpose was to create a cloud of projectiles. It was used in massed formations. Imagine a line of 100 soldiers, each armed with a Zhuge-Nu. They could unleash 1,000 bolts on an advancing enemy in a matter of seconds. The bolts were often dipped in poison to increase their lethality. Even a minor wound from a poisoned bolt could be fatal. It was the ancient equivalent of suppressive fire. It was used to defend fortifications, to protect flanks, and to break up cavalry charges. The sheer volume of fire was enough to cause panic and disruption. The Ming Dynasty writer Song Yingxing, in his 1637 encyclopedia Tiangong Kaiwu, described the weapon in detail. He noted its effectiveness, stating that it is of little use against a lone defiant horseman, but is of great use against a large body of advancing men and horses. The Zhuge-Nu is a prime example of a weapon that was far ahead of its time. While European armies were still relying on single-shot bows and crossbows, the Chinese had a weapon that could be described as a personal, non-gunpowder machine gun. It was a purely mechanical solution to the problem of rate of fire. It required no complex chemistry, just clever woodworking and an understanding of levers. It was so effective that it remained in use in some parts of China until the late 19th century, long after the invention of firearms. Why did this incredibly effective design never spread outside of East Asia? Was the lack of power and range seen as too great a trade-off by other military cultures? And how much did the tactical thinking of strategists like Zhuge Liang, who emphasized disciplined formations and overwhelming force, contribute to the development and adoption of such a unique weapon? Number 9, can you make a rocket launcher out of a wheelbarrow? Imagine a medieval battlefield. The air is filled with the sound of steel on steel, the shouts of men, and the thud of arrows. Then, a new sound, a loud, terrifying hiss. A group of soldiers pushes a strange contraption forward. It looks like a large, hexagonal box mounted on a cart. From the front of the box, dozens of holes are pointing towards the enemy. Suddenly, fire and smoke erupt from all the holes at once. A volley of 32 fire arrows, each propelled by its own rocket motor, screams across the battlefield. They are not just arrows, they are small, unguided missiles. They slam into the enemy ranks, causing fire, chaos, and terror. This was the Huacha, and its Chinese predecessor, the nest of bees. The idea of a multiple rocket launcher in the 14th or 15th century seems completely impossible. Rockets themselves were a new and exotic technology, primarily used for fireworks and signaling. The idea of weaponizing them and then creating a device to fire dozens of them at once represents a huge leap in military thought. It was the birth of artillery saturation, the idea of overwhelming an area with firepower, rather than relying on a single, accurate shot. The concept originated in China during the Ming Dynasty. The nst of Bizi Wofeng was a hexagonal or octagonal rocket pod made of wood or basketry that could be carried by a single soldier. It held 32 small rocket-propelled arrows. The fuses for all 32 rockets were linked together so they could all be ignited at once. This created a sudden, shocking burst of firepower from a single, portable device. The effective range was not great, maybe a few hundred feet, but the psychological impact was enormous. The Koreans took this idea and scaled it up. In the early 15th century, during the Joseon dynasty, Korean scientists and engineers developed the hwacha, which means fire cart. King Sejong the Great, a ruler famous for his interest in science and technology, pushed for its development. His son, King Munjong, is often credited with its invention while he was still a prince. The hwacha mounted a rocket pod, capable of holding up to 200 of a type of rocket arrow called a singejeon onto a two-wheeled cart. This made it mobile. It could be quickly moved around the battlefield to where it was needed most. The hwacha was a masterpiece of engineering. The launch pad had precise holes drilled to ensure the rockets flew in the right direction. The cart provided a stable firing platform. It was used with devastating effect during the Japanese invasions of Korea in the late 16th century, 1592 to 1598. In the Battle of Hangzhou, in 1593, a small Korean force of around 3,000 soldiers, aided by 40 hwakas, successfully defended a hilltop fortress against a Japanese army of over 30,000. The historical records describe the hwakas laying down a literal wall of fire, breaking up the Japanese samurai charges time and time again. What makes the hwaka so bizarre is how it combined several different technologies. It took the ancient technology of the arrow, the new and volatile technology of gunpowder rockets, and the simple, practical technology of the wheelbarrow, and combined them into a single, terrifying weapon system. It was modular too. The launch pad could be removed and replaced with one designed to fire different types of projectiles. The rockets themselves, the singejeon, were also sophisticated. They consisted of a standard arrow with a small paper tube filled with black powder attached to the shaft. A simple fuse was attached. These were not precision-guided missiles, but they did not need to be. The goal was to saturate an area with fire and sharp points. The hwacha was an area denial weapon, centuries before the term was invented. The Nesebis and the hwacha were so advanced that they would not be matched in concept until the development of the Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers in World War II. They represent a branch of military technology that was explored in Asia but largely ignored in Europe until much later. While Europeans were focused on making bigger and more accurate cannons, the Chinese and Koreans were experimenting with massed, unguided rocket fire. How did Chinese and Korean engineers master the notoriously unstable black powder to create hundreds of rocket motors that would all ignite and burn reliably at the same time? Was the hwacha's success a fluke of history, only effective because the Japanese forces in Korea lacked cavalry and powerful artillery to counter it? And could this early form of rocket artillery have changed the course of world history if it had spread to other parts of the globe? Number 8. What is a weapon for throwing, stabbing, and showing off? Imagine a weapon that looks like it was designed by a committee of abstract artists. It has 3 or 4 blades, all pointing in different directions. The main blade is shaped like a sickle. Another blade points straight up, another points down. It has a handle made of wood, bone, or ivory. It is not just a weapon. It is a status symbol, a piece of art, and a bride price. This is the kepinga. The kepinga was a throwing knife used by the Azande people of northern Congo. It is also known as the hunga munga. It is one of the most visually striking and functionally bizarre weapons ever created. Its multi-bladed design seems to defy logic. A weapon should be simple, easy to use. The kepinga is complex and looks incredibly difficult to handle, but for the Azande warriors, it was a highly effective and versatile tool. The weapon was typically about 22 inches long and made of iron. The blades were not just for show. Each one had a purpose. The sickle-shaped blade on top provided the main cutting edge and the weight needed for it to fly through the air. The blade pointing down near the handle served to protect the user's hand from an enemy's weapon. It could also be used to hook an opponent's shield or limb in close combat. The blade pointing up acted as a counterweight and could also inflict damage. The handle was often simple, just a section of the metal tang wrapped in cord or leather. What makes the kepinga seem impossible is its aerodynamics. How do you throw something with such an odd shape and make it fly true? The answer is spin. The kapinga was thrown not overhand like a spear, but horizontally, or sidearm, with a flick of the wrist, much like skipping a stone across water. This gave it a flat, spinning trajectory. The spin stabilized its flight, and because it had blades pointing in multiple directions, it did not matter which part of the weapon hit the target. No matter how it landed, a sharp piece of iron was going to make contact. The effective range was about 30 yards. But the kapinga was much more than just a weapon. It was deeply woven into Azande culture. It was a symbol of power and status. Only professional warriors and nobles were allowed to own and carry a kapinga. It was a sign that you were a member of the warrior elite. When a man wanted to marry, part of the bride price he paid to the bride's family often included several kapingas. They were a form of currency, a store of wealth, because the iron they were made from was a valuable commodity. The shape of the kapinga was also said to represent the genitals of a rooster, a symbol of power and virility. Its complexity and craftsmanship were a testament to the skill of the blacksmith who made it. These were not mass-produced weapons. Each one was a unique piece of functional art. The weapon's primary use was as a projectile, thrown just before a charge to break up an enemy's formation. Imagine a volley of these spinning, multi-bladed knives flying towards you. The effect would be terrifying. Even if it did not cause a fatal wound, it could easily disable an opponent, making them an easy target for the charging warrior with his spear. And if the throw missed, or if the fight came to close quarters, the kapinga was an effective hand-to-hand weapon. You could stab with the top blade, slash with the side blade, or hook with the bottom blade. The kapinga challenges our assumptions about what a weapon should be. It shows that a weapon can be a tool, a symbol, a work of art, and a part of a society's very identity, all at the same time. It is a product of a specific cultural and technological context, a perfect solution to the problems faced by the Azande people. How did the Azande develop the complex throwing technique needed to make the kapinga effective, a skill that was likely passed down through generations? Was the weapon's psychological effect, its bizarre and frightening appearance, more important than the actual physical damage it could inflict? And as the production of these knives has all but ceased, how much of the cultural knowledge and meaning behind them has been lost forever? Number 7. Why would you fight with a deadly ring? Or think of a discus or a frisbee. Now imagine it is made of steel, with a razor-sharp outer edge. You do not just throw it, you spin it on your finger and then launch it with a flick of the wrist. It flies through the air, flat and silent, and can slice through a man's neck from 50 yards away. This is the hakram. The hakram is a throwing weapon from the Indian subcontinent, most famously associated with the Sikhs of Punjab. It seems impossible for a simple flat ring to be an effective and lethal weapon. It has no handle, no point, no obvious way of being used. It is elegant and minimalist, looking more like an ornament than a tool of war. But in the hands of a skilled warrior, it was one of the most formidable projectile weapons of its time. A typical hakram was a steel or brass ring, ranging from 5 to 12 inches in diameter. The outer edge was sharpened to a knife's edge, while the inner edge was left blunt so it could be held. They were surprisingly light, allowing a warrior to carry several of them at once, often worn on the arms or wrapped in their turban. The great Sikh warriors, known as Nihangs, were masters of the hakram. They would often wear larger hakrams around their tall turbans, sometimes carrying 6 or 7 of them. The throwing technique called tandoor is what made the hakram so unique. The user would place the ring on their index finger, spin it rapidly to build up gyroscopic stability, and then release it with a powerful flick. The spin is what allowed it to fly straight and true, much like the rifling on a bullet. The flat profile meant it had very little wind resistance, giving it a long range and high velocity. Reports from the 18th and 19th centuries by British observers in India describe Sikh warriors being able to accurately hit targets at distances of 40 to 60 meters. The lethality of the hakram came from its spinning razor edge. It did not need to be heavy or have a point like an arrow or a spear. It was a flying razor blade, it was a silent weapon, making it ideal for ambushes or for picking off sentries, because it was thrown with a flick of the wrist. A warrior could remain behind cover while launching it. The origins of the chakram are ancient. The earliest references to a similar weapon appear in ancient Indian epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, where it is the celestial weapon of the god Vishnu called the Sudarshana Chakra. This mythological connection gave the weapon a divine status. For Sikh warriors fighting against the persecution of the Mughal Empire, the chakram was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of their faith, their sovereignty, and their willingness to defend their beliefs. The 10th Sikh guru, Gobind Singh, was a master of a martial art called Shastar Vidya, which included the use of the chakram. The chakram represents a high point of personal projectile weaponry before the age of firearms. It required incredible skill, years of practice, and a deep understanding of physics, even if it was an intuitive understanding. It was a weapon that blended grace with lethality. It was simple in form, but incredibly complex in its use. How did ancient Indian metallurgists forge a ring of steel that was perfectly balanced for flight? Was the smooth, unsharpened inner edge the key innovation that turned a simple quat into a lethal weapon? And as the martial arts that taught its use have become rarer, are we in danger of losing the knowledge of how to properly wield this elegant and deadly circle of steel? Number 6, how can a stick throw a spear faster than an arm? Sometimes the most revolutionary weapons are the simplest. Imagine you are a hunter 30,000 years ago. Your main weapon is a spear. You can throw it with your arm, but your range and power are limited. This means you have to get dangerously close to your prey, a massive mammoth or a cave bear. Many hunters are injured or killed. Then, someone has a simple idea. What if you could make your arm longer? What if you had a tool that could extend your reach and multiply your throwing power? This tool was the atlatl. The atlatl, or spear thrower, is one of the oldest and most widespread weapons in human history. The name comes from the Nahuatl language of the Aztecs, but the device itself has been found on every inhabited continent except Africa. European examples, beautifully carved from reindeer antler, date back to the Upper Paleolithic period. It is not a weapon itself, but a tool used to throw a weapon. It is a simple stick, usually 1 to 2 feet long, with a handle on one end and a hook or spur on the other. A light spear, often called a dart, would rest along the length of the stick, with its base engaged in the hook. What makes the atlatl seem impossible is the amount of power it can generate from such a simple design. It works as a lever. When you throw a spear with an atlatl, you are not just using the muscles of your arm. The atlatl effectively adds another joint to your arm between your wrist and the spear. As you swing your arm forward, the atlatl whips forward as well, dramatically increasing the speed of the spear's release. The physics are straightforward but incredibly effective. A skilled atlatl user can throw a dart at speeds of over 90 miles per hour. For comparison, a hand-thrown spear might reach 30 or 40 miles per hour. This increase in velocity translates to a massive increase in kinetic energy and range. An atlatl dart can travel over 100 yards and has enough power to pierce the thick hide of a large animal. It turned human hunters from short-range opportunists into deadly long-range predators. The development of the atlatl was a major technological breakthrough for early humans. It allowed them to hunt more safely and more effectively. It may have contributed to the extinction of large megafauna like the woolly mammoth. It was the dominant hunting and military technology in many parts of the world for thousands of years. The Aztecs were still using the atlatl when the Spanish arrived. The conquistadors, even in their steel armor, learned to fear the atlatl darts, which they said could pierce through a soldier's mail. The darts used with atlatls were also sophisticated. They were not just sharpened sticks. They were long and flexible, often made from 2 parts, a main shaft and a detachable foreshaft with a stone point. This flexibility allowed the dart to bend and store energy during the throw, like a spring, adding even more power to the launch. If the foreshaft broke or got stuck in an animal, the hunter could simply retrieve the main shaft and attach a new point. The atlatl represents the dawn of mechanical weaponry. It was the first time humans used a tool to enhance their own physical power for a projectile weapon. It predates the bow and arrow in most parts of the world. In fact, some archaeologists believe that the bow and arrow may have been developed as a lighter, faster alternative to the atlatl, better suited for smaller game and warfare in forested areas where the long arc of an atlatl throw was a disadvantage. Today, there are a growing number of hobbyists and sport throwers who are reviving the art of the atlatl. These competitions are held to test for accuracy and distance. These modern practitioners have shown that with a little practice, anyone can learn to use this ancient weapon effectively. Was the atlatl invented once and then spread across the globe, or did different human groups independently invent this simple but brilliant tool? What specific hunting strategies and social structures developed around a technology that made big game hunting so much more successful? And did the eventual replacement of the atlatl by the bow and arrow represent a true technological step forward, or just a shift in priorities from power to convenience? Number 5, how do you catch a knight without killing him? Medieval Japan was a land of samurai, honor, and brutal warfare, but it was also a place of law and order. What happens when you need to arrest a dangerous armed and armored samurai? You cannot just walk up and tap him on the shoulder. Killing him might start a war between two clans. You need a way to capture him, to control him from a safe distance. The Japanese police and samurai of the Edo period developed a whole set of non-lethal weapons for this purpose. One of the most bizarre was the sotagarami. The sotagarami translates to sleeve entangler. It was a type of polearm, a long pole with a weapon on the end, but the weapon on the end was not a spear or a blade. It was a complex head of hooks, barbs, and spikes, all pointing in different directions. The pole itself was often studded with spikes to prevent the person being captured from grabbing it. The entire device was designed to do one thing: get tangled in the clothing of an opponent. It seems like an impossibly specific and complicated weapon. Like, why not just use a net or a rope? The sotagarami was designed specifically for the clothing of the time. Samurai wore elaborate armor and loose, flowing silk garments like the kimono and hakama. The sotagarami's head, with its many barbs, was like Velcro for this kind of clothing. Once it made contact, it was almost impossible to untangle. The technique for using it was simple but effective. A group of constables, each with a sotagarami, would confront the target. They would use the long reach of the poles to snag the suspect's sleeves, trousers, or armor lacing. Once one sotagarami was entangled, the suspect's movement would be restricted, and then a second and a third would be used, until the person was completely immobilized, pinned by multiple poles. They could then be safely disarmed and taken into custody. The sotagarami was part of a trio of arresting weapons used by Japanese police, along with the sasumata, a forked pole for pinning a person against a wall, and the tsukubo, a push pole with a T-shaped head. Together, these tools allowed a small group of officers to control a violent individual without resorting to lethal force. It was a sophisticated system of crowd control and non-lethal apprehension. The design of the sotagarami's head often included a swiveling front hook. This meant that if the suspect tried to twist and turn to get free, the head of the weapon would just rotate, keeping the barbs entangled in their clothing. Nick is part of the team, but, this weapon is a fascinating look into a different philosophy of law enforcement. In a society where honor was paramount and a wrongful death could lead to a blood feud, the ability to capture someone alive was incredibly valuable. The sotagarami shows a commitment to preserving life, even in a violent confrontation. It was a weapon of control, not of destruction. Modern police forces still use versions of the sasumata, the forked pole, for controlling violent individuals. The sotagarami, however, has largely disappeared, as modern clothing does not have the loose sleeves and fabric that made it so effective. It is a weapon that was perfectly adapted to its time and place. Did the intricate design of the sotagarami head evolve through trial and error, or was it the invention of a single clever law enforcement official? How did samurai warriors train to defend against these capturing weapons, and does the existence of such a complex system of non-lethal tools tell us something important about the balance between violence and social order in feudal Japan? Number 4, why would you build a dagger into your fist? Most daggers have a simple design, a blade and a handle. You hold the handle in your fist, and the blade extends from the top. But what if you could make the dagger a more direct extension of your hand? What if the blade projected from between your knuckles, turning your punch into a lethal stab? This is the katar. The katar, also known as the punching dagger, is a weapon from the Indian subcontinent. It is one of the most unique and iconic daggers in the world. Its defining feature is its handle. It consists of 2 parallel bars connected by 1 or 2 crossbars. The user grips the crossbars so their fist is enclosed by the parallel bars. The blade, which is typically wide at the hilt and tapers to a sharp point, projects forward from the user's knuckles. When you punch with a katar, you are also stabbing. What makes the katar seem impossible is how it merges the human body with the weapon. It is not just something you hold, it is something you wear. It makes the act of stabbing as intuitive as throwing a punch. The design also provides excellent protection for the user's wrist and hand. The parallel bars act as a built-in knuckle guard. Some later versions, known as hooded katars, had a metal plate that extended over the back of the hand, providing even more protection, almost like a small gauntlet. The katar was a weapon of close quarters combat. It was used by warriors and noblemen, and it was a status symbol as well as a weapon. The blades were often made of high-quality wood steel and decorated with intricate carvings and inlays of gold and silver. The weapon was fast, deadly, and easy to conceal. The origins of the katar are thought to lie in the Vijayanagara Empire of southern India in the 14th century. It quickly spread throughout the subcontinent and became a favored weapon of the Rajputs and Marathas, warrior peoples famous for their martial prowess. For them, the katar was a personal sidearm, a weapon of last resort when their sword was lost or broken. The primary attack with the katar was a straight thrust, using the power of the whole body behind the punch. The triangular blade was designed to pierce through the padded and mail armor that was common in India at the time. A strong thrust could be devastating, but the katar was not just for stabbing. The sidebars of the handle could be used for blocking an opponent's weapon. Some katars even had a surprise. They were scissors katars. The main blade was actually 2 or 3 blades hinged together. When the user squeezed the handle, the blades would spring open, creating a larger wound or trapping an opponent's blade. The katar represents a completely different approach to knife fighting. Instead of relying on slashes and complex wrist movements, it focuses on the simple, powerful, and direct motion of a punch. It is a weapon of pure aggression. Its design is ruthlessly efficient. There are no wasted parts, no unnecessary flourishes. Every element of the katar is designed to make the act of killing more direct and more effective. How did the unique H-shaped grip of the katar first develop? Was it an adaptation of a different tool or a completely new invention for combat? Did the existence of the scissors katar create a psychological fear in opponents who never knew if a simple dagger might suddenly transform in a fight? And why did this incredibly effective and ergonomic design never become popular outside of the Indian subcontinent? Number 3, how do you turn a chariot into a lawnmower of death? The chariot was one of the first great weapon systems of the ancient world. It combined speed, mobility, and a stable platform for an archer or a spearman. It dominated battlefields from Egypt to China for over 1,000 years. But some cultures took the chariot and added a terrifying new feature. They attached long scythe-like blades to the axles, extending horizontally for several feet on either side. This turned the chariot from a mobile firing platform into a weapon of pure terror. This was the scythed chariot. The idea of a chariot with spinning blades on its wheels seems like something from a fantasy movie. It is brutal, unsubtle, and seems impossibly dangerous for everyone involved, including your own troops. But it was a real weapon used by the Persians, the Greeks of the Seleucid Empire, and the Kingdom of Pontus. The goal was simple: to break up enemy infantry formations. A line of scythe chariots would charge at a solid block of infantry like a Greek phalanx. The infantry had 2 choices. They could hold their formation, in which case the chariot would plow into them, the blades cutting off legs and slicing through bodies, creating a gruesome gap in their line. Or they could break formation and run, in which case they would become vulnerable to the regular cavalry and infantry falling behind the chariots. It was a psychological weapon designed to cause panic. The Greek general Xenophon, in his work Anabasis, gives a vivid description of the scythed chariots used by the Persian king Artaxerxes II at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC. He wrote that the chariots had scythes extending slantwise from the axle trees and also under the driver's seat, turned toward the earth, for the purpose of cutting to pieces whatever they met. But the scythed chariot had major weaknesses. It needed wide open, flat ground to be effective. Any rough terrain could break the chariot's axle or get the blade stuck. It was also vulnerable to disciplined and well-trained infantry. The Romans, when they faced the scythed chariots of Antiochus the Great at the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, developed a specific tactic to defeat them. The Roman historian Livy describes how the Roman legions would not stand firm. Instead, as the chariots approached, they would open up lanes in their formation. The chariots would pass harmlessly through these gaps. Once inside the Roman lines, the chariot drivers were isolated and easily surrounded and killed. The Romans also used caltrops, small spiked iron devices, to lame the horses. The scythed chariot was a one-shot weapon. It was good for an initial terrifying charge, but once it lost its momentum or became separated from its army, it was useless. The drivers were exposed, and the horses were a large target. It was a high-risk, high-reward weapon. If it worked, it could win a battle in minutes. If it failed, it could cause chaos in your own army as the panicked horses ran wild. The weapon represents a sort of brute force approach to military innovation. It was not subtle, it was not elegant, it was a terrifying machine designed to inflict maximum carnage. It shows a mindset that valued shock and awe above all else. Its eventual disappearance from the battlefield shows the triumph of disciplined tactics over pure terror. Were scythed chariots ever as effective as ancient historians claimed, or were their descriptions exaggerated for dramatic effect? How did the drivers manage to control a team of horses at full gallop with giant spinning blades just a few feet away from the animal's legs? And does the scythed chariot represent a dead end in military evolution, a terrifying idea that was ultimately too impractical to be truly great? Number 2. Can you build a sniper rifle in the Roman Empire? The Roman army was an engineering marvel. They built roads, aqueducts, and fortifications that still stand today. Their army was disciplined, organized, and well-equipped. We think of their weapons as the gladius, the short sword, the scutum, the large shield, and the pilum, the heavy javelin. But they also had a secret weapon. It was a piece of artillery, but it was not for knocking down walls. It was for killing individual soldiers from a great distance. It was the Roman Scorpio. The Scorpio was a small, powerful catapult, or more accurately, a ballista. It was a torsion weapon. This means it got its power from 2 bundles of twisted rope, usually made of animal sinew. 2 wooden arms were inserted into these rope bundles. A string was stretched between the arms. When the arms were pulled back with a winch, the ropes twisted even tighter, storing a huge amount of potential energy. When the trigger was released, this energy was transferred to a bolt or a stone with incredible force. What makes the Scorpio seem impossible is its accuracy and power. This was not a clumsy area effect weapon like a trebuchet. This was a precision instrument. The Roman writer Vegetius, in his work De Re Militari, described the Scorpio as the crossbow and said that it could pierce an enemy horseman covered in armor at such a distance. A typical Scorpio could fire a heavy iron-tipped bolt over 400 yards, and it could be aimed with surprising accuracy. Each legion had a battery of about 60 Scorpios. They were the legion's sniper rifles. Imagine being a Germanic warrior facing a Roman legion. You are standing on a hill hundreds of yards away thinking you are safe. Suddenly, you hear a whack and a hiss. A bolt the size of a small spear hits the man next to you with enough force to go straight through his shield and his body. You cannot see who fired it. You cannot hear the order. There is just silent, sudden death from a distance. The psychological effect would be devastating. The Scorpio was used in both sieges and open battles. In a siege, they would be mounted on towers or on the city walls to pick off defenders. In an open battle, they would be placed on high ground or on the flanks of the legion to provide covering fire. Julius Caesar used them to great effect during his invasion of Britain in 55 BC. He describes in his commentaries on the Gallic War how he used his artillery, including Scorpios, to drive the Britons back from the beaches, allowing his troops to land. The engineering behind the Scorpio was incredible. The torsion springs had to be made from specific materials like horse sinew or even human hair, and carefully wound to provide the right amount of tension. The frame had to be strong enough to withstand the immense forces involved. And the trigger and aiming mechanisms had to be precise. The Romans were masters of this kind of mechanical engineering. They even developed a repeating version called the polybolos, credited to the Greek engineer Dionysius of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, which had a magazine and a chain-driven mechanism to automatically load and fire bolts. The Scorpio shows us that the concept of long-range, precision firepower is not a modern invention. The Romans understood the value of being able to kill the enemy before they could even get close enough to fight. The Scorpio was a weapon of technology and discipline, a perfect reflection of the Roman way of war. How did Roman engineers achieve the level of precision needed to make a torsion weapon an effective sniper's tool? Was the polybolos repeating ballista a real functional weapon or more of a theoretical design that was too complex for widespread use? And why did this advanced torsion spring technology largely disappear from Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, only to be replaced by the much simpler tension and counterweight siege engines of the Middle Ages. Number 1, did an ancient battery power a weapon of the gods? In 1936, workers digging a railway near Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq, found something that should not exist. It was a small clay pot about 6 inches high. Inside was a copper cylinder. And inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod held in place by an asphalt plug. When archaeologists examined it, they realized it looked remarkably like a simple galvanic cell, or a battery. It was dated to the Parthian or Sasanian period, sometime between 250 BC and 640 AD. This is the Baghdad battery, the existence of a battery nearly 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta invented the modern battery in 1800 is one of the greatest mysteries of archaeology. What was it? There are no wires, no light bulbs, no motors from that period. It is a power source with nothing to power. It seems completely impossible. Several experiments have shown that if you fill the pot with a simple electrolyte, like vinegar or grape juice, it will produce a small but measurable electric current, typically around 0.5 to 1.5 volts. It works, it is a real battery, but the question remains why. One of the most common theories is that it was used for electroplating. The Parthians were skilled metalworkers. They could have used the battery to apply a thin layer of gold or silver onto a cheaper metal, like copper. This would have been a form of gilding. Experiments have shown that this is possible with the small amount of current produced by the battery, though it would be a slow and difficult process. But what if it was used for something more bizarre? The context of the find is important. It was found in the ruins of Seleucia, a major center of learning, and, some believe, magic. What if the battery was not for a practical, industrial purpose? What if it was used in a religious or medical context? One theory is that it was used for a form of electroacupuncture. A healer could use the mild electric shock produced by the battery to treat pain, similar to a modern TENS unit. Another, more dramatic theory connects the battery to religious ritual. Imagine a priest standing before a crowd. He touches a metal statue of a god. The people who then touch the statue receive a small, tingling shock. They would believe they had felt the power of the god himself. The battery, hidden inside the statue, would be the source of this divine energy. This is where it connects to weaponry. What if this principle was scaled up? What if a series of these batteries were linked together and hidden inside a weapon, like a mace or a scepter? A warrior priest could carry this weapon into battle. When he struck an enemy, they would not only feel the physical blow, but also a disorienting electric shock. It would be a weapon that seemed to have supernatural power. It would be the ancient equivalent of a taser. This is, of course, pure speculation. There is no direct evidence that the Baghdad battery was used as a weapon. But it is a tantalizing possibility. It fits with the idea of a weapon that is both a physical tool and a psychological instrument. A weapon that delivers an electric shock would be terrifying and inexplicable to people who had no concept of electricity. It would seem like magic. The Baghdad battery is the ultimate impossible ancient object. It is a piece of technology that is 2 millennia out of place. It forces us to question our entire understanding of the ancient world. It suggests that there were pockets of knowledge, of scientific understanding that were discovered and then lost, only to be rediscovered thousands of years later. Was the Baghdad battery a one-of-a-kind invention, or were there thousands of them that have simply not survived? If they were used for electroplating, why have we not found more examples of electroplated objects from that period? And the most shocking question of all, if ancient people could build a battery, what other modern technologies might they have discovered, the evidence for which is still buried, waiting to be found?